this, our third program in our series, Baytown, the early years, and tonight we'll focus on industry. I want to say again that I'm grateful to Lee College and especially Alan Swenson and his students for videotaping the program, and we'll be able to circulate these tapes, which will be very nice. And we thank the Baytown Sun and especially David Moulton for the coverage of the programs. Tonight we'll hear from four panelists, Raymond Kilgore, Jimmy Carroll, Lawrence Reilly, and Roy Elms, who will tell us about the early days of industry. We will start with Raymond Kilgore, who grew up in Baytown, in Cedar Bayou, with the brickyard and the shipbuilding business. Mr. Kilgore.
Thank you, Ms. Mayor, and I want to thank you all for coming out. But I know you chose to do this, but there's too many other things you could be doing. When you go back to the early years in Cedar Bayou, well, I suppose you'd have to start with the farming, because that was the main source of making a living. They farmed cotton and corn. Of course, they always had the vegetables. They had to have raised vegetables, they had something to eat. And then they had to raise feed for the livestock. And there was ranching. And as the herd grew, when they got ready to sell off some, they'd have to drive them over to Lynchburg, which is over here some 12 to 15 miles. And I'll tell you a little story about what my father told me. It happened on one of those trips. This particular rancher, he took his little 7-year-old son along with him on this particular drive. And there were some 5 days on the trip before they got back home. So when they got back home, his father was asking him, he said, "Son," he says, "did you enjoy yourself?" He said, "Oh, yes, Mother." He said, "Well," so what else?" He said, "Well, I know this. Yeah, the other half of this world is as big as this half. This is someplace." Well, that's sort of the way I am. Of course, we speak of this, and they had to have something to moonlight with in those days to make a little extra pocket change, so they started working on brickyards. They could work on a brickyard, make $1.25 a day. And that was pretty good pay, I guess. So they could go to work at daylight, and at noon they could have their day made, as long as they made 5,000 bricks. And there was always a team of 6 to constitute a team. And so they was really working. And I'd give them time to go home and do all the other chores around the place and keep that going. Of course, in those days, why, they only made brick during the summertime, in the early fall. Because of the bad weather, why, the brick would freeze and crack and this, that, and the other. But that would be pretty good, because then they could go to the woods and cut wood, have wood to burn to cook the brick with. So they could have all year-round employment by working with the brickyards. And to just look into how the bricks were made, it was all manpower, horsepower in those days. It wasn't any electric motors or anything else. It was all just whatever you could muscle out, well, that's the way you done it. You would start out with what they call the molding pit. Not molding pit, but the pit where they mix the mud. They'd have a pit about 4 feet wide, 7 feet long, about 3 feet deep. And the day before, they'd have 2 of these. The day before, while they'd haul in the clay that's going to use the next day, and haul in the water and let it step for 24 hours to let it season. And then the next morning, they'd come to work while they start shoving this mud out into a mill, which is a very crude mill. It was just a box about 4 by 4, about 5 feet tall, got a post down through the center of it, with some posts out from it, with a long, crooked arm coming out with a horse tied on it, would go around and around and stir this mud up, see? And the more he stirred it, the drier it would get. And down at the bottom, molder, he would pick up a bunch of it. I don't know how he could do it, but they claim they could do it pretty accurate. They just reach out with his hand and just grab him a bunch of mud and just throw it into a mold and it'd be just about exactly what you need. I guess that comes from years of experience. And the molds were 3 brick molds. And after he finished this up, another boy would pick up this pallet with the 3 brick in it, set it over and turn it over and pour the brick out onto a board, and then he'd take it over to the drying shed. Well, when it first started out, they had just a level place out on the ground. They just stack it out there. That's why they got the name for it, brick yard. But that wasn't too economical because if it rained or something other, it lose all the brick. So they had to come around where they had to have a drying shed. They had to build a shed up over it. They did that. And then, at all this time they're doing this, there'd be 4 men involved in this. Then it'd take about 10 days for these bricks to dry in the drying shed. Then there'd be 2 men on the other side taking them and going into the kiln and stocking them. There'd be one wheelbar man pushing the wheelbar and the other what's called the set. And to sort of hasten through it, and then we come on down to where they burn the brick. They generally have about 4 or 5 high kilns, and they'd be about 4 feet wide and 4 feet high. And on the first day, they just start a small fire in this thing. Next day, they'd increase it. Third day, they'd increase it. By the 4th day, they'd have it just as hot as they could get it. Just keep poking the green timbers to it. And that would go on in for day and night through the 8th day. And then they would just seal it all up, throw dirt over the top of the kiln, seal it off, and let it set for 10 days. And by that time, the brick would be cooked. And the way they got them out of there, take them out on schooners. And a schooner could haul about 30,000 bricks. Ordinarily, these kilns would have about 300,000 bricks. And so then, with the schooners, they had trouble getting down the valley. So they devised a plan where they take put a boy on a horse with a saddle, take a rope tied to the bum and tie it to the house on the mast and go and just go along and drag it. Till it gets on down to the mouth of the valley here where the wind could get done. Need a horse to sail and going out across the bay with the guys. And so then, of course, with the boats, well, that brought on the shipyard. They'd have shipyards take care of the boats. But before that, I'll get ahead of myself a little bit here. Of course, that was in the early years. In the latter years, by the brick making was changed considerably. Instead of making mud brick, what they call a molded brick, they had what they call a press. This brick here is a molded brick. I guess it's some 100 and some odd years old. That's just hand molded. Very light. Now here's another brick. It is pressed. This so happened to be on my father's brickyard, and my home is built out of this brick that came out of this kiln. This is one that left over in 1940. And this is what they call a Roman tile brick, due to the fact that they had rough edges. And the way that gets that is stamp out 4 bricks at a time and just break them off. See? That gives you the rough edge. And but this is filed in one way to make the bricks come on. Now, at one time, I'm getting staying with the brickyards. I need to try to see if I can get something on this thing over here and try to show you. To all accounts, the one I get to bottom, my alley, AC alley, was in 1848. There's an ad in the Galveston News where he was advertising brick. Also had a shipyard. And he had 600 acres. He's trying to get somebody to come in and buy some and develop it. So I'm presuming that's about the earliest there is. And going up about a little further, and you have that's Asheville Smith, Colonel Asheville Smith. That's just below where the Spur 55 goes across the Cedar Valley. And he sold it in about 1872 to Father McComb Wright, which finally was offering to give Rosen Park and all of that to Rice. And then if you come on up by the brother, be my father's shipyard. And on up a little further, Mike Casey brickyard. And then the Solander shipyard, Thale brickyard, which is right there where Houston Light and Power is now. Where they used to be. And then the W.D. Hayden shipyard was just around the corner there, right in behind Cedar Crest Cemetery. Down on the bottom. And you go around the bend a little further, and then that's where my father had his brickyard, but he bought it after about 6 or 7 hands on down, handed down there sometime. He bought it in 1939, so it's number of hands if I do before we got that far. And as of now, it's not the one brick company operating around there, that'd be the Aztec brick company out there on Interstate 10. When you come over here on the Huber Corporation, you got the Davis brickyard. Down below that a little bit is the Ed Smith brickyard. In fact, this brick is where it came from, off the Ed Smith. I'm sure it's that old because I know that my father acquired the property in 1934. So we were out there in the 40s doing some work. And I run across this old brick kiln, and this was complete brick, but too many grandchildren around, I guess. Took care of that. Then as you come on down, you have the McGee. And I blocked it out by half of it. Then you have the Casey, and the Rosen, and the Mile. That's right there from 146 across the Cedar Valley. You come all around the bend, there's the McLean brickyard. A little bit farther is the W.D. Hayden brickyard. And then we'll get back to where it was. At one time, they said there was 11 brickyards operating on the stream of Cedar Valley. Must be wrong, in between the years of 1850 and on up to about 1871 or 2 along in there. So it was sort of a growing industry that time. But as time goes on, they improved it. And today, why, brick making is altogether different. They have the press. They have a mill that grinds up the clay. And they have a shed. Now they go around the clock making brick. So they have all indoor shelters, buildings that bring the clay in to keep it dry. And then sort of computer operated. When the press kicks out 6 bricks at a time, like hits the conveyor belt, takes it on around, goes into the kiln. Got brick setters back there picking up, stacking them in there. So it eliminates lots of steps that way. But getting back to the shipyards now, I presume the first shipyard was that of Collins, was down at the mouth of the bow we spoke of a while ago in 1848. And then the next one I know of would be Mr. Solander's shipyard. You know, the little gully comes down by the side of the Cedar Valley Methodist Church, right across the bow from Houston Light and Power. It was right there in that little gully where he used to set up and made his boats. I remember as a kid, I used to go visit a good friend of mine, Jack Kelly. They lived there, and his daddy worked for him. And the next one would be W.D. Hayden. Of course, he was doing all of his work. He was in the shell business then. And so he was doing his own repair work. My father worked for him until at the early age of 18, decided he wanted to go out on business for himself, so he built his plant in 1896. And he operated there until 1956, I think it was. And I'll tell you a humorous story about it. I remember every fall we'd get a lot of yachts come in there, be repaired, cleaned up, and get ready for the spring and summer season. And was a fellow named Mr. Dixon. Had a nice pleasure boat. Worked out of Galveston, had one worked out of Houston. Take out excursions, fishing, or whatever you want to do. And he come in there during the fall this year for his general overhaul. And he had a son named Franklin, about our age. He'd come over to the house at night. And he didn't use the language my father preferred to have around his children, so he talked to my uncle just across the Bible, and he says, I want you to do something. He said, Frank, you'll be over at the house tonight. He said, I'm going to get telling a few ghost stories. He said, I want you to meet him as he goes back down to the bow. And have a sheet over your head and come out and grab it. Well, Dad told ghost stories around that. He was so scared he wouldn't hardly leave the house. And finally, he left and he was going along, and they said he was sort of singing and whistling and looking and going on. And just he got by this sort of it was a cypress break in there. And my uncle began to sort of groan until he stopped and he looked and he began to back up. And about that time he come out and waved this sheet. Well, he just took off. When he got to his skiff, he didn't take time to get in. He just dove over and right on in the bow of the phone car. The skiff was too slow for him. Time to move on. But you're talking about the shipyard business. Why, that was a good business for Father. It started him off on many other endeavors. I remember he used to build barges and stuff, and it would be sold and shipped down far to Mexico, and all up and down the coast. His barges were being bought and used. Of course, one thing runs into something else. And he had two people come to him one time back in 1926 and wanted to know if they'd go in business with him to build a shell business. So Dad thought it over, and he knew one fella, but he didn't know the other too well. That's all he knew. He said, I knew he didn't have any money, but he thought the other fella did, so he agreed to it. And they would all want to go in a third on everything. So after operating 2 years, there still wasn't anything coming in, so Dad with his lawyers set it up where they had to put up the money or just get out. So that's what he did, and that's where he got into shell business. So then we operated shell business then up to 1956. That was sort of my baby. And just some harrowing experiences I can tell you about doing those things. One thing I love to reflect back on and think about, it was about 5 of us in the shell business in those years. And it wasn't a thing that either one of them wanted to do for the other one when he needed help. All he had to do was let it be made known. Because here they'd come. And it wasn't a matter of, well, I don't know what I ought to ask them not. Just ask them, because here they'd come. And I remember one time a dirt and all wester popped out, and I had one of my towboats got caught out there, and he stumped both of his barges, and he was lucky he didn't sink the tug, but he got in. And happened early one evening. So then the next afternoon, well, I knew that the wind was going to abate, so we had our derrick barge and everything ready, so we took off and went back out in the bay, and just by dark, got out there around 8 or 9 o'clock, and we worked all night and unloaded the barges, and was trying to pump them up. Got one of them pumped up. It was around daylight, and I noticed Hayden Company over there. They had a towboat over there also. Way out on top of the reef with 3 barges. No way to get to them. So I told him, I said, well, let us get through here and I can go over there and help you get out. So we went over there and helped him free up. And he came over and helped us finish ours up. And all by night, everybody was out on the way home. So it was you do a good deed for me, I'll do one for you. But like I said, one leads to the other. So in 1930, we went into the material business. Just part of the continuation of the oyster shell business. We opened up a material yard, and on the stream of Goose Street, right by the railroad crossing, crossed over Market Street. I never will forget, I came home from Dallas from school, SMU in June, got in that night, and the next morning my dad called me about 5 o'clock. He said, get up, son. I said, okay. So I came downstairs, and we was eating breakfast. He said, what you going to do today? And I said, oh, I don't know. I think I'll go to town and see if I can who I can run into and see what's happening. He said, oh, I said, I got a little project for you. I said, sure enough. He said, yeah. I said, but Dad, I really don't have any work clothes. I said, maybe we can do this tomorrow. He said, oh, I've got something here to fix you. So in a little bit, he came back, throwing on a pair of overalls and a jumper, straw hat, a pair of old broke ends, and he said, put these on, and we'll be ready to go in a minute. Well, I did, and we got in, and I thought we were going over to the shipyard. He said, oh, no, I'm getting a car. We got in the car, and we was driving along. I said, where are we going, Dad? He said, oh, he said, if I tell you, you know much about my business as I do. Well, we got out there at the crossing, he just stopped, and I said, what's the matter? He said, oh, I said, this is where it is. Get out. Get that shell that's in the back. I said, oh, what am I getting into? But anyway, it was a large sand mound there. And he said, it'll be another fellow here with a dump truck after a little bit. He said, I want you to start shoveling right through that thing, 10 feet wide, and cut it down to the level what this other track is. I said, what's all this about? He started, we're going to run a railroad spur in there and open up a building material yard. I said, oh, yes, sir. Well, we worked there for about 4 or 5 days. Just as fast as we could shovel that stuff, all that downhill. Went there one morning, and some brand new drag line sitting on the railroad car. That's the way, so you can have one load that today. We got that thing off, and the next day, the guy reeked up, and went in there and went to work. I was home that night, and I said, Dad, you know, I said, I worked out there now for 5 days real hard. And after you got that drag line there, he said it took him about 10 minutes to do what I've done in 5 days. He said, well, I said, you was busy, wasn't you? I said, he said, you weren't in any trouble with it. I said, no. He said, well, just don't complain. That was my father out there. As long as you keep working, that's the main thing. But building material business went on to other things, ready mix. We've seen the ready mix go from a yard and a half mixer on up to 12-yard mixers. When you first started out, your way boxes, the volume boxes, just hold so much, and of course you'd have to reach and then shove in the corner started to get the right amount in the weigh box. So then in years it would change where they weigh it, which is much more economical, easier to do. And of course that was all just hand operated. So they went from hand to air with ramp. Now they're going with the computers. You punch out on a card and make it you want, the number of yards you want, just stick it in the machine, punch a button, and it'll do everything with you talk to you. When the load is ready to go, you just say load truck. And you better have a truck under there too, because it's coming. So these things are, I guess, when you think about it and look back, it does us good to reflect, look at how things were 100 years ago, 150 years ago. And I'm so thankful that our forefathers, they did that. still out there shoveling that mud in the brickyard or something like that. Well, I thank you all for listening so nice to me.
Someone who really doesn't need an introduction, Mr. Jimmy Carroll, who can tell us about the early years at Exxon.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm not a public speaker, I'm a storyteller. On the first day of July 1919, I got off the jitney at the railroad station in Goose Creek. And there was a man standing there, and I said, where's the refinery they're going to build, or building? He said, well, it's right down that track there. And I said, well, how do you get there? He said, just count those ties, it'll take you right to the refinery. But in the meantime, a man came along on a railroad velocipede. And if any of you know what a railroad velocipede is, it's a little instrument that has a motor on it that has two wheels on one side and an idling wheel on the other side, and this thing was loaded with lunches. And I got on that thing and went to the refinery. And when I reported to my employer, he said, I thought you were going to come to work this morning. Well, I said, I've been on the way since 7. He said, well, it's 12 now. You're not going to get paid for the day. And I said, well, that'll be fine. I'll go tomorrow. This company that the Elms company, of course, you know, was spawned in this little town of Elms. And those gentlemen, if you don't know this, and if you do, pardon me, but those men each pledged $1 million to form the Elms company. And they were in a feed store owned by Mr. R.S. Sterling, who at that time was in the, not only in the oil business, but in the feed business, because Mr. Kilgore said didn't have anything but mules. And built all the tanks, all the earthen tanks with mules. So they went in there, they organized the Elms company. They just shook hands around the table and said, we're in business. Well, they didn't have any money to build any pipelines, so they had a lot of oil on the ground in these pits. They couldn't move it. So they went to New York and got some money from the Standard Oil Company furnished them the money. And then they decided to build a refinery. Well, the refinery at Elms wasn't much used because they had no deep water and they didn't have the land. They had the land here and it was in the deep, right on the deep water. So then the first thing they had to do is get here. Well, they built a railroad, which was from Dayton to Goose Creek, built a railroad. And then, after they got the railroad built, had hauled all the material in here, and then there was a great shortage of manpower because at that particular time, the first war was just had been over about 6 months, and there were an enormous amount of soldiers still on the other side, and there was a great shortage of manpower. So, in order to get the laborers, the company employed a gentleman to go to Eagle Pass every Monday morning. He'd leave Baytown with 3 passenger coaches. And the following Saturday, he'd come back to Baytown with 3 coaches with people from down below. And they'd have everything on earth that they owned with them. The man would have a blanket roll on his back, and maybe a frying pan, and maybe a couple of skillets and a pot, and a ladder. All of them had a ladder, brought a ladder with them. Well, the lady would probably have a few clothes hanging on her back. She'd be holding on, maybe she'd be dragging 2 or 3 children. And they took them up in the north end of the refinery, on the northeast side, Earhart Drive, along there. And they put them in tents up there. They had about 100 tents up there, I imagine. And they put those people in those tents. The tents were boarded up 4 feet, and they had a roof on them, a canvas roof, just like a tent would be. But they were boarded up on 4 sides, about 4 feet. And they had a stove in there, and that was all it was in that tent, was this stove and some cots. And they come in the meantime and bought an enormous amount of surplus Army cots and several carloads of Army blankets. And they just furnished those people with those Army cots with blankets. They had a big commissary, and they'd go down to the commissary. You couldn't buy anything with money. You had to have coupons, and they'd furnish the people with coupons, and they'd go down there and buy the groceries. Then when they started to build the refinery, which they were in the process of doing at that time, they had no mechanical equipment at all. There was none out there, with the exception of 2 motor vehicles. They had a 1-ton truck and a 1/2-ton Ford pickup. The rest of it was all mule power. And they practically built the first refinery with mules and a gin pole. Now, if you don't know what a gin pole is, I'll tell you what that is. It's a great big log that's sticking vertical. And at the bottom of it, it's sitting in a platform that's built for it. And on top, it has guy lines going from all directions. Then they put a pulley on top up there at the top. And then they harsh the material with the mule power. And they hitch the mules to this line, and they pull these instruments, whatever they're pulling up, steel, mostly, all steel. Just pull it up, and a man would never get behind his mules. He always stood in front of them. Talk to them, just tell them to come to him, and they'd come. And when he said stop, they'd stop. I've seen mules pulling a load, and the back band on the top of them would be that high off the mule's back. They'd be pulling so hard to hold that load there. Well, they had all these people there, and then, excuse me, that was one group. Then there was another group of mechanics. There were no houses in Baytown, not this Baytown, the refinery Baytown. There were no houses out there, and they must have they had 4 tent colonies out there at one time. No family tents, all of them were singles tents. They had one for the colored people, one for the Latins, and had 3 for the Anglos. And on down there by where the post office is now in Old Baytown, that was where the Anglo tents were. And they had a big, huge dining room there. And it was divided into 2 sections, with a kitchen in the center. The elite ate on one end, and the peons ate on the other. And the people who ate on the end with the tablecloth, they had tablecloths, and we ate on benches. Couldn't buy that, couldn't buy a meal there with money either. You had to have a ticket to buy 40 cents for a meal. And that's where you ate. And then they started to build a refinery, and they started out, and when I got here in July, the refinery had been in existence about 3 months. Those people came in April and set the stakes up and surveyed that refinery. And that thing was, the year before they built that refinery out there, that had been a rice field. And there were no streets out there. None. They were just, like Mr. Kilgore said, you just went down yonder. And the weather that year, it rained every day from July to October, I believe. And I have seen 4 mules pulling a wagon, and it'd be up to the bottom, at the bottom of that wagon in the mud, and they'd just be pulling it. And all the people wore rubber boots, and they had to tie their boots on them so they would come off. If you didn't have your boots tied on, when you get stuck in mud, it just pull up, your boot would just come off. And then, when we got these places built, there were the first houses that the company built in Baytown were over on Market Street, right across the street from where the Federation office is, Marvin versus Stowe. There were 13 houses right there on that street. that's where all the people who came here from New Jersey to build a refinery, the nuclear refinery came in. That's where they were housed when they got here. And then down below that street, the Texas company at one time, they had a loading dock down there, along with the Sun Company. They also had a loading dock. And the Sun Company had one house down there. Texas Company had 5. And that Sun Company house is still there. It's on the corner of Missouri and Oklahoma. If you go down Oklahoma Street and look to the right, you'll see a 2-story house sitting right off the side. And that's the old Sun Company house. And those tanks there by the Methodist Church, those were at one time Sun Company tanks. And when we wanted to go to town, nobody had an automobile. If you had one, we couldn't go. Wasn't no place to go. There were roads, but there were no roads. So at night, the company had a train that ran from Goose Creek back to Baytown and brought the workers who lived in Goose Creek at that time, which were very few. And at night, that train would run back to Goose Creek to take all the people that lived in Baytown to the pig show, wait for us, and when the pig show was over, we'd go back home. And that's where we did our shopping. We had to come to Goose Creek on the train. And then when they built that road that goes down there alongside the railroad, but then they were going to have kidneys, and they charged you 25 cents to come over here to Baytown. And then when they got to the refinery, while they were doing that, the company was building a town site over on the west side of Baytown, and that's where the company built concrete houses. Those houses were 3, 4, and 5 room houses. Had 2 or 3 6-room houses over there. And those houses were being rented to the employees very reasonable. And they furnished you with all the facilities. Your light bill was $3, and you furnished your water, and you paid your gas bill or whatever it was. After they got gas, when we first went over there, cooked with kerosene. And about 1921, 2021, I can't remember. I think it was 21. When they got all the stuff built, the first part of it built, well, they were going to have the officials come down from Houston. Mr. Johnny Bonner, who was the vice president of the company, had a very spacious yacht. He was going to bring them down in his yacht. He brought them down to the dock. They had a big pre-soda dock down there. And so they wanted to make a big impression up there on the stills. So they wanted to let them see the stills, how they operated. And so the powers that be told them, said, now we're going to fill this vessel up with water. We're going to put a raging fire in that thing and throw a lot of crude oil in that furnace. So when they come down the channel, they'll see that smoke coming out of that smokestack, and they'll think the refinery's really going. And that was one of the things that they did. And then they built 10 stills. And then after they built the first 10, they built 3 more. And those stills were operated very crudely. They were very primitive distillation, just about next to nothing, just about as good as you could get in that field then. And then in 1923, they built another battery of crude stills. And that battery of crude stills was, at that time, was the most modern battery, not in Baytown, or not in the United States, but in the world. And I was fortunate enough to have been working on that unit. And now that is about all I can tell you about the early part of the refinery. And I want to tell you one thing. Some firsts meet. I was the first man that ever made 40 years in that refinery. And I was also the first man that lit a natural gas fire under steel. And that was just about like going to the moon. Because he didn't know what was going to happen. And I said to you, thank you.
probably altered some of the things that I thought I wanted to say this evening. There may be some people in this audience that don't know too much about me, but back when Jimmy was talking about this town in 1919, when he appeared on the scene in July, the following year, 1920, I was here with my family. Of course, I was only 2 years old. But we go back quite a ways. We've reminisced many times about Baytown, the refinery, and all of the things that have gone on out there. Talk by the hour. And my father was one of the ones that came down from New Jersey and participated in the building of the refinery. I spent a good part of my life in these concrete houses that Jimmy was talking about with the family. That was my own family. The other day I was looking at the Baytown Sun and the column that they go back and reminisce 55 years. They're getting it back pretty far now. But I noticed that Jimmy referenced the mules and the refinery. There was an article there the other day about Homer Davis. Now, Homer Davis was I don't want to call him a mule skinner. He was a contractor. But he had a corner on South Texas as far as mules are concerned. And there's just no telling how much money he made off the Humboldt Refining Company supplying mules, but he did the job. That's the way they moved them around. And I remember back in the middle 20s, being out in the yard, barefooted, dirt streets, and at 4 o'clock, teamsters didn't have to drive those mules to the corral. All they had to do was hear that whistle, and here they came. And the mules would come up those dirt streets from everywhere and head for the corral and walk right in and just practically go to where they were supposed to be. I was also reminded at the time about the ice wagon that used to come around. Nowadays we have our ice machines and our refrigerators. And I remember many times going out on the porch and having this old wagon drive up with this team of mules. And the fellow driving there would get out and he'd go latch on to a 50-pound block of that ice and bring it in and put it in the kitchen in our ice box. And that's what we had. That was sort of primitive at that time, you know. But it's like everything else. We were also thrilled, you know, when we had fans. They were the greatest thing in the world. If you didn't have a fan, you thought you'd die. Then the next thing, you come along and you get one of these little 42-inch, 36-inch fans that you exhaust fans you put on the back porch. And man alive, now that was heaven. And that put the fan out of business, really. And if you didn't have that, you couldn't stay in the house. You didn't know what to do. And then you moved to the window units, and now we're up to the point now where we have our central heat and air. So going through all of that, and that was fine. We lived with that. We couldn't today. I don't believe any of us could go back and start living on a day-to-day basis using some of those primitive things that they had in those times. I thought many times after talking with Audrey about this early industry in the Baytown area, you know, you can get strung out, give them 10 minutes. 10 minutes is not much time to talk, but being influenced some by what Jimmy had to say, back in the middle 30s, I started with, at that time, old Humboldt, working in the summertime. And we used to get jobs in those days, school kids. We'd go out and after school was out, and we'd get our jobs and go out and dig ditches, go down to the old compound and roll barrels and throw around cases of oil and things of that nature. And it was pretty much, as Raymond pointed out, you did it with your hands. You didn't have conveyor belts and things of that nature in those days. And we worked real hard. And then at noontime, it came time to eat lunch, you'd get up in a boxcar where the doors were open, 12 to 12:30. You would have already eaten what lunch you had, so you just laid down in the doorway of the boxcar and let the wind blow through and cool you off and sleep for 30 minutes. Now that was young kids doing that, so you can kind of get a feel for how hard the work was. And it really was. I'm reminded, touching on some of the personalities of the time. At that time, and I'm sure some of you will recall, Mr. Tart, Robert Tart, lived in old Baytown. He was one of the pushers down in the compound. And with all due respect, he was a great man, dearly loved him, but he was what came pretty close to being a Simon LeGree. You really couldn't take a deep breath and stop, but he wasn't right behind you, pushing you along. And he got the work out of us. And all of that was really good. We got 45 cents an hour for that, and that was kids, and that was really great. That was my baptism to the Baytown refinery as far as working was concerned. I had been baptized in the refinery since year one through family connections. Then after I'd gone to school and came back during the early part of the war and went to work at that time for what finally turned out to be about 41 years. Which at this point in time, I just can't believe it. But I did manage to put in 41 years at the refinery. At that time, too, during the war, you recall there was a time of changing technology. Jimmy has alluded to the old shell stills that they had. In all honesty, I believe I was in every shell still that Hummel had. Inside it, around it, behind it, and everywhere else. They supplanted those slowly but surely with pipe stills. Pipe stills were the modern way of conducting distillation of crude oil. They had better efficiency, they could charge more crude, they could make more products, and that contributed to the war effort at that time. They also, at that time, in the early days, and right up to during the war period, they had the old cross coils, or cranking coils they call them, which was, they were used as a means of cracking gas oils to get gasoline at high temperatures and pressures. Very dangerous pieces of equipment at that time. They operated at extremely high temperatures and extremely high pressures. They had, during the years, many very bad fires that took lives. Many of them present here tonight know. I witnessed one time. I won't tell you about it. It was so bad, but I did see it. And so they had their time for that. Well, they came along then and they put in the fluid catalyst cracking units. That was the modernization to do away with the old cracking coils. And of course that gave a bigger quantity, higher quality gasoline from the gas oils that they cracked at the same high temperatures and pressures with fluid catalyst. And they supplied, as many of you know, better than a billion gallons of aviation gasoline during the war. And I was doing a little research a few nights ago on that, and the fluid catalyst cracking units account, the cracking units themselves, not just Baytown, account for approximately half of the gasoline production in the world. They make it in cadmiums. And interestingly enough, during World War II, these gaseous byproducts that came from the making of this aviation gasoline and the cadmiums was used to produce butyl rubber, which went into the manufacture of butyl rubber at that time to take the place of the natural rubber that the Japanese had cut off from us in the Far East, in Singapore, Burma area. And Old Humble made their tremendous contribution to that effort. I wanted to touch on some personalities of the era. And I don't want to go back any further than the early 30s, middle 30s. I recall them as easily enough, but the one that I remember vividly was Mr. Powell, R.E. Powell. Mr. Powell was the manager of the refinery, and I do mean the manager of the refinery. He ran it, and like nobody ran it before or after. He had enemies, but he was also very respected. He had a tremendous sense of humor for the position that he held in the company. I'm reminded of a story, and this is a true story. They were in the midst of hiring some people. And in those days, that was quite an operation to hire some people, even if they did stick them out in the labor gang. And Mr. Powell had insisted that they send all the applications of these prospective employees over his desk. He wanted to see them. So this particular application came over his desk, and where it said denomination, this person had put 2 or 3 things, Presbyterian and Episcopalian. He had 2 or 3 denominations besides this question. So Mr. Powell got his red pen, and out in the aisle on the application, he wrote with an arrow pointing to that, but Part Airedale, question mark, and sent it back. In the midst of all of his trials and tribulations, he did have a sense of humor. Mr. Powell left the refinery and went to Houston as on a promotional basis, and was a manager of refining operations for Humble Oil Refining Company. He died in around 1947. In 1937, a man came to Baytown to be the manager, and I'm sure is probably as well known to this group and the people of Baytown as anybody, and that was Gordon Farnell. And he managed the Baytown refinery from 1937 to 1961, the longest tenure of anybody that's been there. He was affectionately known as the Little Gray Eagle. I have personally some very fond memories of Mr. Farnell. Those one thing that he did that not many did. And was he always kept his door open. And no matter who it was in the refinery, from the laborers to the top, if anybody had a problem or a question, or needed some information or help or guidance, they could get in to see him and get an audience. And for that, he was very much admired and respected and commanded the respect of all of the people in the refinery. When Mr. Farned left, when he died in 1961, Mr. Meyer, many of you have heard of Herbert H. Meyer, took over. Mr. Meyer had a totally different background from Mr. Farned. Mr. Meyer was very well educated. He came to the Humble Oil and Refining Company in research and development capacity. He made some very, very significant contributions to the Humble Oil and Refining Company. Among them was the development of the old 997 motor oil, which many of you remember. He also had a part in the alkylation process in the refinery. That was the additive that was put into the aviation gasoline to improve the octane numbers, and did such a great job for us in the war. He had a hand in that. He had a hand in the settling ponds. It was his idea, as a matter of fact. He got an award from Harvard University for the settling ponds that you're all acquainted with out in the refinery, where they run the oil and water through there, skim that off, and settle it out, and then put the effluent into the channel. It's much far cleaner than it used to be before that was done. So he made a lot of very, very significant contributions. Another, I think probably his major contribution, and I would like to tell you about this, because, it's not a little bit ticklish, but I think it's worthy of your knowing and worthy of the man. If you recall, back in the late 50s, in 60, 61, 58 to 61, the refinery had prided itself on not ever having had a layoff of employees. At the end of World War II, the refinery had approximately 4,700 employees. This was about 1947. 4,700 employees. That was due to the war effort. Anybody had a warm body was brought aboard, put to work, and then all of a sudden, the need wasn't there anymore, but yet they still had to keep it. Well, in their wisdom, what they did then, for about 15 years, 10 to 15 years, was let that number dwindle by normal attrition. No layoffs. People left. People passed away. They curtailed their hiring programs to their needs. And they let that number attrit. They got it down to 1958. And then another problem appeared on the scene. If you recall, they were building refineries around the country about that time And they were running them with very few people and putting 125,000 barrels of oil through the little refinery that they built. Very modern installation with very few people. Highly technical with all the modern technology. And the people in the local refinery here realized that this, at that time, was recognized as the biggest refinery in the world, but technologically it was not on a competitive basis with these other little refineries that were putting out the product. So they had to make a decision, and they had to go back to what they called the grassroots effort and try to bring this refinery back as close as possible to what they were having to compete with in the marketplace. To do that, they didn't need as many people as they had, even with this many, many years of attrition. So what they did, and many of you are aware of it, they instituted some retirement programs. And they must have had 4 or 5 of them in that period. Everybody that qualified, aged in service, could take a retirement that was souped up, if you will, over and above normal. And many elected to do that. Not pressured to do it, but elected to do it. Hopefully, they thought they could get the numbers that they needed then by doing that and not be faced with a layoff. So they went through those programs. But let me tell you, let me digress a minute though and make the point that I wanted to make that gets back to Mr. Meyer and his farsightedness. While all this was in the talking stage, there were many meetings held in the management circles as to the overall impact that this was going to have on the community of Baytown. This was going to be a very, very big thing, and it was going to impact this community. The question became one of how do we soften that impact? And Mr. Meyer said, we'll do it by communicating with the people in the community, the business leaders, everybody in the community that we can get in, and the employees of the refinery. We'll lay the groundwork. We'll talk to them, tell them what we have to do and why we're doing it, and have enough time to bring all of this into fruition properly. For those of you that remember that period, that's exactly what happened. There were those community meetings. There was a tremendous lot of communication and explaining to gain the understanding and acceptance of the people in the community to soften this. And as a result, that came off, my own personal feeling, and I think it's shared by many, as one of the major happenings in the Humble Oil and Refining Company. One that could have been a disaster if handled improperly or too quickly. But it came off just beautifully, recognizing that many people retired during that 3 to 4 year period. And finally, when they got down to the lick log, they had to lay off 100 people, finally. But they did that, and with the proviso that if things improved, that they would come back and offer those same 100 people they were about to lay off their jobs back. And they did just that. Many of them didn't come back, but every one of the 100 that they laid off got their jobs offered to them within that year. Many of them came back. That was the subject of a thesis by a young man who was doing his doctorate work at Harvard University. He covered that whole operation from start to finish. It is written up. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen that or read it. If you haven't, it's worth the time and the effort. That whole operation from start to finish. And I think, when I look back, I give Mr. Meyer a tremendous lot of credit for his contributions to the company. Now, he went on, he managed till 1968 when he retired at age 65. He died here 2 or 3 years ago. I'll tell you an amusing story about Mr. Meyer. He was an avid Texas fan, University of Texas. If you ever tried to say anything about the Longhorns, forget it. And I remember in my early days, Evelyn and I were fortunate enough to go up to Austin, and he had family in Austin. We went up to see a Rice, Texas football game. We were invited over to the Meyer house after the ball game. And in that ball game, George Walmsley played for Rice. Texas won the ball game 12-7. George Walmsley ran a kickoff back 95 yards. They ran him out of bounds at the 3-yard line, and then Rice didn't score. And in those days, many people, including us, wore a hat. I had a felt hat. So we went over to the house afterwards, and I had that felt hat with me. And I left it there in the house. And when we left after the doings, I left my hat in the house. And when we got back to Baytown, and during the festivities there, Mr. Meyer was on cloud 9 because Longhorns had won. And I made the stupid mistake of walking up to him and telling him that, you know, but for that 3 yards, I said, Rice could have won that ball game. Well, when I said that, that was just the wrong thing to say. And so when I got home, I didn't have my hat. I'd forgotten it. And I was afraid to go home. I said, well, go over to the house over there and ask him. I said, no, I'm not going to do it. I don't want the hat. So I think as it turned out, Helen must have mentioned it to Ms. Meyer. Anyhow, I did get my hat back from Austin, but not because I asked for it, because I was scared to death. But he was a great Longhorn, and then when he retired, he moved to Austin, and I think he gave Darrell Royal a lot of help up there too every week with the running of the football team. Now, to bring this to a close, some other personalities that I recall, many of you recall. One that I would mention is Harry Ferguson. Harry Ferguson ultimately was Executive Vice President of Humboldt Refining Company. He started here in the Baytown refinery. He graduated at the University of Michigan, and he came out of school at Baytown. He was in the technical service. He headed the technical service in the very early days. And he worked his way on through and wound up, as I say, as Executive VP of Old Humboldt. Harry Ferguson was a very down-to-earth man. And anybody could talk to him. He knew everybody. He did a lot of things for Baytown. He was instrumental, along with Mr. Baker, Heinz Baker, in getting San Francisco Methodist Hospital put here for the community back in the 40s. And he made many, many other contributions. Mr. Ferguson has now passed away. Another personality that comes to mind, Russell Venn. He also came through the Technical Service Division here in the refinery, and he went on to manage the refining department. He was a sort of a protege of Harry Ferguson's, and made his mark with the company. And then in later days here, many of you recall Mr. Carlson, C.D. Carlson, Process Superintendent Carl Obershek, his right-hand man, Mr. W.P. Willis, who was Chief Engineer, Mechanical Superintendent, W.H. Weaver, who was assistant to Mr. Willis. Our good friend, Harry Hartman, who is still with us here. All of you know Harry Hartman. All of those fellows made a very, very significant contribution to the success of the Hump Company in the early days. And then to conclude, back in 1972, when they put all of them together, Carter and old Humble and Essel, and then merged it into what we now have as the Exxon Corporation. That happened in 1972. And as a lot of you know, that was an interesting story. They spent 3 years coming up with the name Exxon. They had lawyers, linguistic experts, a leading design firm that worked, I don't know how many millions of dollars they spent researching to find a name that they could have for the company that didn't have any connotations of any kind in any language and was unique in itself. And after 3 years and many millions of dollars of research, that's the name they came up with, Exxon. And Audrey, I could just rattle on here forever, but I'm going to sit down now and give somebody else a chance. Maybe we can talk a little bit later. Thank you very much.
Mr. Roy Elms will tell us about Ashland Oil and Refining Company that used to be off of Fairway Drive.
I'm not old enough to take you back as far as these fellows have taken you. But I'm very happy to talk for a few minutes about a plant that came in here and was built because of a need and because of pressure. A plant that was operated for some 35 years under 3 different ownerships. A company that contributed greatly, I think, to the community life while it was here, and filled a need nationally that was a real need at that time. Back in the early 1940s, the entire world, or a good part of the world, was at war. People in America were riding on cars, in cars, on rubber tires. Because of the war with Japan, the supply of natural rubber was cut off from us, so we had to get into the synthetic or unnatural or man-made rubber business. The United States government got into that business by creating a business called Rubber Reserve. And the purpose of Rubber Reserve was to make tires for us to ride on when natural rubber was not available. They called upon the rubber companies who was at that time making tires and other products from natural rubber to get into the synthetic rubber business. They built plants all over the country. Goodyear built a plant in Fort Neches. Firestone built a plant in Fort Neches, or at least the government built them and gave them to these companies to manage. There was a plant built in Baton Rouge that was operated by a group of rubber companies. Goodyear was elected to build a plant in Houston and in Baytown, but it was decided that no company would be allowed to have more than one rubber plant. So the plant in Baytown was assigned or turned over to General Tire and Rubber Company. General Tire, along with associations of a company in Cambridge, Massachusetts called General Latex and Chemical Company, began the planning of the Baytown plant. Technicians and chemists were recruited over the country, largely through Purdue University and through Carnegie Tech University, along with some southern universities. This small group of technical people were trained for a short time at the Goodyear and Firestone rubber plants in Akron, Ohio. In early 1943, prospective employees for the staffing of this Baytown plant were already in the war effort, either in the military or in another war effort plant, and they were not too much available for staffing a new plant. So we began to look for people. We hired them from the barber shops, from the retail stores, from the area farms, and from the school system. We hired a good many school teachers on a war effort basis. We began our operations actually in June, I believe it was, of 1943. And the third day that we began operations, a cyclone, a hurricane rather, hit this area. And after 3 days of operation, we were down for some 2 weeks. No warning came about this hurricane. Weather reports was top war secret, and nobody knew too much about the hurricane that was approaching. The next morning, after this hurricane hit, a man we had hired from West Texas came into my office, laid his badge on my desk, and said, "I'm quitting. I can't take any more hurricanes. I can stand the sandstorms of West Texas, but no more hurricanes. If you want to pay me for this 3 days work, okay, mail me a check. If you don't want to pay me, that's okay too, but goodbye." I mailed him a check a little later, but I never heard from him anymore. This group of new employees had learned how to start up a plant, but they had not learned how to stop the reactions of a plant that was in operation. You may remember that out here on Ashton Street, next to our plant, And adjacent to the Humble plant, the government was instrumental in building a camp. They called it Camp Doodle. It was a shack town. But employees from General, employees from Humble, because Humble had put in a war plant and were making butadiene, you probably remember, and construction people lived in Camp Doodle. After living there for 2 or 3 years, the need for it was no longer present. It was torn down, and I don't know what happened to it. Most hourly people that we had recruited back in these days worked for 60 cents an hour. Some few of them maybe made 75 cents, but some few of them made 40 cents. The withholding tax that was taken from their paycheck was established on a basis that puts you into a bracket. Some of these 60 cents an hour people had a bracket of $2 a week taken out of their check for income purposes. On one occasion, we gave a 5 cents an hour increase to workers. One man in particular had his withholding tax increased from $2 an hour, about $2 a week, to $2.40 a week. At 5 cents an hour on a 40-hour week, that was over $2 a week. He came in and asked us to take back the 5-cent raise that we had given him. After the war, the rubber industry was well established, and Congress passed legislation to sell the rubber plants to private industry. They offered the plants that the companies had been operating a chance to buy these plants, and they offered the General Tire plant here in Baytown a chance to buy it for $4.4 million. General Tire thought that was too high. I think they must have wanted to buy it maybe for a song, and they turned the offer down. Congress passed legislation to close the plant, and the rumors were that the plant would be closed by a certain day. A group of local people felt like that the plant was a good thing to own and a good thing for Baytown. So with the help of Representative Albert Thomas, they got the Congress to open bids again for the plant and allow it to stay open if any company wanted it. This group of people, local people, bid $5 7/10 million for the plant. But they received a higher bid from United Carbon for $7.5 million. So the plant was sold to United Carbon Company and operated under the term of United Rubber and Chemical Company. In 1963, this plant was sold by United to Ashland Oil Company and was operated as under the name of Ashland Oil and Chemical Company. During later years, the demand for rubber was unstable. The demand and the price went up and down. The plant had periods of short production, and next week it might be into a long production period. Two incidents that stood out in my memory of the plant was a strike we had. It lasted several weeks. But the plant was operated by supervision and was not shut down. Another instance that I recall was an explosion we had at one time in which 3 people were killed. That was on a Sunday morning. I went out to the plant as quick as I could and was asked to take all incoming telephone calls. Soon after I got there, I got a call from a news agency in New York City saying, I understand you had an explosion in your plant.